Hello, 2322. I'm wearing my rock t-shirt. I wanted to go over the poetry of John Donne today, as well as the three Donne questions. When we get to that section, you have your choice of doing Donne or the poetry of Shakespeare and his sonnets. So there's only three questions. And I thought I might start saying something about the Petrarchan sonnet. You may have heard of that, the Petrarchan tradition in English literature. Petrarch was an Italian poet in the 14th century that wrote about love. In love with the idea of being in love, put your love on a pedestal. At my old school, I worked with nuns, and there was an 80-year-old nun. And when we got to this section, I'd pretend that I was in love with her. Sister William, it's a boy's name, but it's a girl. Sister William is the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. Sister William's beautiful eyes. She doesn't burp. She's perfect. So Petrarch, from my notes, had unrequited love for a woman named Lara, but he was in love for love's sake. It's comparable. I'm not talking smack here, but sometimes when you're 16, when you're 18, when you're in high school and you're coming into who you are, you just want to be in love. You want to be in love with someone. It's cool. It gets the juices flowing. You're just in love with life. You want to be in love. But somewhere in the mix, the poet was the hunter, and the object of his affection was a deer, spelled differently. And you should also take note, the feminists, that the poet was almost always a man. So, and the man was after the woman. If you look at modern sonnet themes, the tragedy of unrequited love. Maybe you're married to someone else, but you see a beautiful stranger in a coffee shop, and you want to be in love with someone. Poet's fiery passion for a cold woman. Generally in that society, the man had all the power, but in a lot of these poems, the male poet kind of flipped that. So the poet would say, I'm totally submissive. My love is completely dominant. And in real time, the man had the power and the woman didn't. But a lot of times the artist would flip that. And the last question on that sheet, do real artists need to suffer for their love? A lot of musicians that die, maybe someone like Kurt Cobain, could he have written beautiful songs if he wasn't suffering for his art? And the Petrarchan tradition, the poet suffers for his art. I love you so much, I can't do without you. I can't live. I'm totally submissive to you. So when we get to John Donne, and I'm going over the sheet, his dates were 1572 to 1631. Donne's life, his autobiography, can kind of be divided into two sections. He was fairly wealthy. His family was wealthy. He was, in his youth, he was a playboy. The old school Southern word would be rake. So he spent a lot of money. He had a lot of girlfriends. He traveled throughout Europe. And a lot of his poetry was about the girls he met, the affairs he had, like the fun he was having. My note says he merged the profane and the sacred. So the tradition then was religious poetry, write about God, write about being, doing good works, write about going to heaven. But John Donne kind of combined this religious poetry, this religious imagery with more sexual poems, like The Flea that we'll get to. So he kind of had a reputation as a dirty poet or a naughty poet. So, but eventually he married Anne Moore and had 12 children. Later in his, I'd say mid-30s, he became a reverend. He became a minister. He became a man of God. So his younger poems, earlier poems, He was a rake. He was a playboy, a lot of girlfriends in Europe. But his older poems, his later poems, are about reverence for God. A lot of his poetry was confessional as well. He was confessing like what he'd done, the affairs he'd had. And a lot of his readers would read the poetry trying to figure out who a certain girl was or what he was doing. On the sheet, perhaps his most famous poem is The Flea. And The Flea, to some degree, it can have an impact on the modern reader. He is trying to seduce his beloved, his ideal, and a flea comes in the room, and he notices that the flea bites his beloved, the girl. The flea bites him, and his argument, there's some sirens, we're in Odessa. He says, the flea bit you, has your blood in him. The flea bit me, it has my blood in him. So our blood is already mixed in the flea, so we should go ahead and do it. And again, it's a fairly bawdy poem. It got a big reaction in 1600. Sometimes it gets a big reaction in 2020. But the message is a bit carpe diem, seize the day, live your life, have fun. Another poem on the list that I chose is The Canonization. The poet and his beloved, their love is all-consuming. Their love is a legend. There's a lot of metaphors he uses. Their love is like an eagle that flies. Their love is a candle that's always burning. But their love is immortal. Canonization, to some degree, he is so in love with the girl that he should be a saint. Their mutual love should give them both sainthood. So their love is almost religious. It's so perfect and so beautiful. My note says, don't hate me for loving you so much. I think you get the point. Death Be Not Proud is an older poem. Reverend Donne is sick and dying, maybe of typhoid, but he's reflecting on death. And his strategy is to personify death. He makes death into a person. He tells death, you're too proud. And he says death is a slave to other forces. Desperate people, kings, fate, chance. So maybe in the mix, Reverend Donne is afraid of dying, but he's telling death, I'm not afraid. And then a valediction forbidding mourning. He's married. Donne is traveling in Europe, and his wife is at home. There's a lot of, maybe in the last three lines, there's compass imagery, like his wife is the center of the compass, and he's traveling, but his wife centers him. He's able to do what he does because she's the center. And their love is the greatest thing in his life. Their love can move, and he can move, but his wife is grounded and centered. And it's really a love poem for his wife. And a valediction is a 36 word or 36 line love poem. And he mixes his main themes mix religion and sex. So you can find that in most of his poems. When I get to the Donne questions, number one, ask about the flea, which is probably his most famous poem, the poem we talk about today. He's certainly a flirt, but the question asks, how does that particular poem coincide, interact with Petrarchan tradition, ideal, perfect love, and there's religious imagery, stuff like that, but ultimately he's mixing in the grotesque, the sexual, the body. So it's sort of Petrarchan tradition connecting, meshing with the way Donne writes, which is sexual, a little bit dirty. Canonization, ask about the Catholic tradition and praying to a religious speaker. According to the speaker, who should the reader canonize and why? We went over this before. he's so in love with his beloved that their love should be canonized. He's saying their love is greater or as great as religion, as God. So all the other people should respect their love because it's so great. And then the last question, ask about, it says pick a poem. Most of them are a bit similar, and talk about how Donne uses religious and sexual imagery. We've talked about that a lot. In my way of thinking, the part about being in love with love, Petrarchan tradition, is kind of philosophical. Love is a concept, but the actual act, what he has, the bodiness maybe, is more practical. So in my way of thinking, he's merging the philosophical aspects of love with the practical aspects of love. And I think you know what that is, Texas. Okay, that's John Donne.